Hey, wake up. It's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast. And I'm Sam Sachs, the only newsman in America who thinks the weed is not too strong. Not at all. Keep it coming. I can handle it. Hey, did it seem to you like there were a lot of strikes last year? Well, that's because there were. New data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that there were 33 major work stoppages in 2023. That's the highest in nearly a quarter century, which sounds like a long time, but it's really just the year 2000, which makes me feel hella old. I don't know about you. Where was I? Oh yeah, labor power. The 33 major strikes in 2023 was double the average over the last 20 years. Overall, there were nearly 459,000 workers involved in those strikes. And by major strike, that's one that involves 1,000 or more workers and lasts at least a day. So that would include your Hollywood writers and actors strikes, the auto workers strike, the Kaiser healthcare workers strike, just to name a few. But even this latest data from the BLS doesn't totally reflect the resurgence of labor last year. It only counted major strikes, leaving out pickets at smaller workplaces, like, for example, Starbucks. According to the Labor Action Tracker, created by researchers at Cornell University and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, there were actually 466 strikes in 2023. Now, that's still well short of the peak years of labor strikes that were seen in the mid-20th century, but it's still a resurgence given the dismal state of unions recently. And there's good reason to think that this trend will continue. The United Auto Workers just announced that it was going to spend $40 million over the next 2 years organizing non-unionized auto workers and battery makers, particularly in the South. And $40 million can pay for a lot of organizers to fan out across the country. The UAW began this latest organizing campaign last year, and already 10,000 new auto workers have signed union cards, including a majority of workers at a Volkswagen plant in Tennessee. The union hopes to meet its goal of organizing more than 100,000 new workers by 2026. That would translate to a more beefed up labor movement just ahead of UAW President Shawn Fain's call for a general strike on May Day 2028. Times of Israel reported that the Biden administration is preparing a second round of sanctions against settlers in the West Bank who are engaged in violence against Palestinians. Earlier this month, the president issued first of their kind sanctions against 4 Israeli settlers, and last year the administration announced visa restrictions against certain settlers as well. According to the Times, this second round will target higher profile extremist settlers, but, and this is key, will not include government officials. Well, it should, like National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's been motivating the violence in the West Bank and even had his ministry purchase 10,000 assault rifles to give away to settlers living on illegally occupied land. There's a video of Ben-Gvir personally overseeing the gun giveaway. Here it is from Middle East Monitor. Ben-Gvir is the dork in the white shirt behind the table, shaking hands with everyone as they pick up their gun. As this video makes perfectly clear, settler violence is not due to a few bad actors. It's a program endorsed by the Israeli government itself, all the way up to the top, especially after the October 7th uprising. This is from NPR, quote, "To maintain the military presence in the West Bank, the military mobilized thousands of reservists as part of newly formed regional defense battalions. It also strengthened what the government called emergency response units made up of heavily armed civilians. In many cases, according to activists and Palestinians, those ranks have been filled by the very far-right Jewish settlers who have been at the center of much of the violence. Settler violence is now surging in the West Bank, with Palestinians getting shot, beaten, their homes and businesses ransacked. But this isn't a post-October 7th phenomenon. It's always been this way. This is from the Washington Post back in 2021. Quote, Israeli settlers have dramatically increased their attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank over recent months, with violent incidents up about 150% in the past 2 years, according to data presented by the Israeli military at a defense ministry meeting this month. A United Nations agency has separately found that 115 Palestinians have been beaten or otherwise attacked by settlers since the start of the year, with 4 fatalities, and more than 300 incidents of property destruction, including olive trees cut and burned during the autumn harvest, were documented over the same time period. So this has been a problem, mostly ignored by the US for decades. Only now has it gotten so bad that the Biden administration is meekly sanctioning individuals for, again, a policy that's systemic. This is from Israeli human rights group Bet Salem on the complicity of the Israeli government in all of this. Quote, the military avoids confronting violent settlers as a matter of policy. Although soldiers have the authority and duty to detain and arrest them, Israeli security forces routinely enable settler violence against Palestinians and their property. As a rule, the military prefers to remove Palestinians from their own farmland or pasture land rather than confront settlers using various tactics such as issuing closed military zone orders that apply to Palestinians only, or firing tear gas, stun grenades, rubber-coated metal bullets, and even live rounds. Sometimes soldiers actively participate in the settler attacks or look on from the sidelines. What's revealed by all of this is a glaring double standard: individualized punishment for Israelis who do bad, and collective punishment for Palestinians. I mean, the entire campaign in Gaza, which is funded and armed by the United States, is a form of collective punishment against Palestinians for the actions of Hamas. Another example is what happened to the UN Relief and Works Agency in Gaza, also known as UNRWA. On the same day last month that the ICJ found it credible that Israel was engaged in genocide, the US and other Western countries announced that they would suspend funding to UNRWA. The decision to cut off funding was supposedly based on an Israeli intelligence report that members of UNRWA also belonged to Hamas and were involved in the October 7th attacks. It was claimed that a dozen workers were involved, which is just a minuscule fraction of UNRWA's total workforce in Gaza of more than 12,000 people. But still, the US treated it as a systemic problem and moved to cripple the aid organization. And to make matters worse, the claims from Israeli intelligence about UNRWA now appear to be totally bogus. Shocking, I know. The Wall Street Journal reported this week that a US assessment of that intelligence couldn't verify the claims of UNRWA members working with Hamas. Israel claimed that as many as 10% of aid workers in the organization were also Hamas. But according to the journal, quote, the US can't verify Israeli allegations that a larger number of UN workers have links to militant groups, people familiar with the report said. Also, quote, the US's National Intelligence Council, a group of veteran intelligence analysts, said it assessed with low confidence that a handful of UNRWA staffers participated in the October 7th attack. And on that allegation that UNRWA as an organization collaborates with Hamas, the assessment found, quote, that the reality of Hamas's control in Gaza means that the UN agency has to interact with the group to deliver humanitarian relief, but that doesn't mean that the agency is collaborating with the militant group. Okay, cool. So are we going to resume full funding for UNRWA now? Are we? Or are we just supposed to forget about all this and move on? The defunding of UNRWA, the largest aid organization in Gaza, will result in more death and suffering for Palestinians, which happens to be exactly what U.S. lawmakers want to see. And at least one is even willing to admit that. Check out this video of U.S. Congressman Andy Ogles being asked about how U.S. weapons are killing children in Gaza.
I've seen the footage of
You've seen footage of
shredded children's bodies. And that's my taxpayer dollars. I'm going to bomb those kids.
So I think we should kill them all, if that makes you feel better. Everybody, come on.
Are you taking that part?
Yes.
He said, I think we should kill them all. Andy, we're talking about kids. Kids. You sick fuck. Ogles represents Tennessee's 5th congressional district, but he's trying to get himself represented in a legal filing before The Hague for inciting genocide. Religious fascists keep trying to enforce their freak ideas on the rest of us. This time, it's the ones on the Alabama Supreme Court who just ruled that frozen embryos, often used for in vitro fertilization, are themselves human children and are afforded all the protections under the law. The case stems from an incident in which a worker at a fertility clinic went into the cryogenic nursery to retrieve stored embryos but accidentally dropped them on the floor, destroying them. The parents who underwent IVF and chose to have their extra embryos stored at the clinic then sued, alleging wrongful death. The lower court tossed out the suit, ruling that embryos are not actually people, but the state Supreme Court took up the case and reversed that decision. Chief Justice Tom Parker wrote in the ruling, quote, "The people of Alabama have declared the public policy of this state to be that unborn human life is sacred. We believe that each human being, from the moment of conception, is made in the image of God, created by Him to reflect His likeness." Have you seen an embryo, dude? You're telling me that's what you think God looks like? This ruling will have extreme ramifications, particularly if other religious zealots get this precedent established in other states too. As the Alabama Medical Association noted in its filing, which I guess was ignored by the court, the ruling will dramatically increase liability for fertility specialists, which will increase costs of IVF, putting it out of the reach of families who have no other way to conceive a child. And if frozen embryos aren't allowed to be destroyed ever because they're considered human life, then, as the Alabama Medical Association argued, that will require parents to pay for their storage indefinitely, to keep embryos, quote, in cryogenic storage even after the couple who underwent the IVF treatment have died, and potentially even after the couple's children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren have died. Some clinics will likely stop doing the procedure altogether out of fear of being sued, since IVF can often result in embryos being damaged and discarded. In fact, the largest hospital in Alabama announced it would pause the procedure after the court's ruling. This is just all so absurd, but it's the kind of absurdity that Nikki Haley endorses. After the court's ruling, Haley said she agreed that embryos are human life. Nikki Haley had a son thanks to IVF, proving once again there's nothing Republicans love more than taking things away from people that they themselves benefited from. Let's open up the archives. It's This Week in Working Class History. A big one to start off. This week in 1848, the Communist Manifesto was published. You might have heard of it. A little book by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels about historical materialism and class struggle. It went on to motivate working people's movements around the world, and it toppled quite a few governments too. In terms of books with an impact, it's one of the GOATs. Sticking around the 19th century, we've got the Lynn Shoe Strike in 1860, the largest pre-Civil War strike in U.S. history. Shoemakers were already getting shafted before the walkout. New stitching machines led to mass layoffs and wage cuts. Men, women, and children toiled in the factories for as little as $3 a week. That was for the men. Women and children made less. So the workers organized under the newly formed Mechanics Association. They issued demands to the manufacturers, but were ignored. So they went on strike. Started with 3,000 shoemakers in Lynn, Massachusetts, but it quickly expanded to every single shoemaking town in New England, from Massachusetts to New Hampshire to Maine. And 20,000 workers were on strike. They were supported by their local communities. And when the cops came in to break the strike, a crowd of 8,000 people in Lynn showed up in defense. Picket persisted for more than a month and a half, and workers eventually returned to the job in exchange for a 10% wage increase. They, however, did not get their union recognized. Moving right along now to 1951 and a general strike in Grenada, which at the time was still a colony of the British Empire. Workers demanded higher pay and recognition of their union, the Grenada Manual and Mental Workers Union. The British weren't chill at all about this and sicked the military on the striking workers. There were riots, several men and women were killed, but the struggle endured, and the strike lasted all the way into May, when the workers agreed to a 50% pay increase and 7 days paid leave a year. One of the strike leaders, Eric Gary, also formed the Grenada United Labor Party, which went on to win a majority of seats on the Legislative Council in elections a few months later, the first elections held in Grenada under universal suffrage. All right, next up, 1965, when civil rights leader Malcolm X was assassinated during a speech in New York City. While he's best known for his revolutionary black nationalist message, he was also a socialist and an anti-imperialist. He once said, quote, "You can't have capitalism without racism," and that, quote, "You have to have someone else's blood to suck to be a capitalist." 3 members of the Nation of Islam were arrested and convicted of Malcolm X's murder, stemming from a feud he had with the organization. But decades later, 2 of the 3 men were exonerated and released from prison. The NYPD botched the investigation from the get-go, and to this day, questions persist about the assassination and whether there was a conspiracy behind it that involved the U.S. security state. And finally, let's wrap it up with a recent one, 2018 in the West Virginia teachers' wildcat strike. Teachers defied state law and their own union leadership to walk off the job, protesting their low pay and crummy new health insurance plan. Schools were shut down across the state, giving 250,000 kids a break from class. About 2 weeks later, state lawmakers capitulated and passed legislation giving the teachers a pay raise. To learn more about these stories and other events that happened this week in working class history, check out the project online, listen to the podcast, and subscribe on Patreon. Back with more next week. All right, friends, the show ends this morning with a sunrise from North Carolina. It was captured by Carly in Asheville. Enjoy. Thank you, Carly. Show's over. Thanks for watching. Thanks to the team behind the scenes. Please sign up for Means TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast, and follow us on social media. One day capitalism will fall. Until then, we'll be right here. I'll see you tomorrow.